You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello and welcome to the Catholic Mama podcast. I'm your host, Christine Mooney Flynn, and as it is Sunday when we are recording this, here's my husband.
Hello, Sunday evening, so a little different time than usual, but...
Yes, it is. Well, it was Happy Father's Day.
Thank you very much.
You're a wonderful father.
Thank you.
Always, and I appreciate that you led the entire rosary tonight.
I did. That was my Father's Day request.
That was very nice. And as we're talking, I just saw a dog with its own leash in its mouth zip down the street right behind you. So
fantastic.
I'll keep everybody posted if I see something comical pass by as well. But that dog just hauled it and no owner in sight. He's taking himself for a walk.
Yeah.
That's a nice thing to do in an evening.
It's cute. Mm-hmm.
A nice summer evening, now that it is summer.
Indeed.
Well, yeah, we got to Mass. I love this. If you are listening, the person who saw me, or maybe you just follow me on Instagram, I'm not sure which, but our van broke down after daily Mass on Friday, right? Friday. So we at least got to Mass after daily Mass on Friday, right? Friday. So we at least got to Mass before for the Sacred Heart, the Feast Day of the Sacred Heart.
Yep.
And because we live near family, bonus points for living near family, we had an easy ride home. The car was left in a safe spot in a church parking lot. Oh, the dog just went by again.
Wow, look at that. Yeah, good for him.
It's free.
He's having a great time.
We got home in time still to have our Sacred Heart enthronement ceremony, which we will talk about in another episode. I'll do a blog post on it at least. It was wonderful. Mm-hmm. I don't know where this is going. Oh, yeah, that's right. Our van broke down, so we had to go to Mass, just with one child today because you just have a little Subaru.
Just a little Subaru.
A little Sub. So we dropped the 3 older kids off at my in-laws, and we go to a church. It's like 30 minutes away. They don't always go to.
St. Jerome's in Economwalk for any Wisconsinites. Beautiful parish. Definitely check it out.
It is. It's one of those churches that was built in recent...
Definitely check it out.
It is. It's one of those churches that was built in recent years, but it doesn't look modern.
Gives me hope for the modern
hope. It's beautiful.
Architecture.
Yeah, I know. The altar is beautiful. The stained glass windows. It has perpetual adoration. Many of the women there wear veils. Mm-hmm. It's just great. Yeah. It's great. It's not uncommon to see people receiving the Eucharist on the tongue. It really it gives hope for the Novus Ordo and newer churches.
And it's one of those examples where, because it's beautiful and because it's quite orthodox, it's got a vibrant parish. I mean, it's always very full. There's tons of people there. Yeah. It's a great. I want to say it seems like a great community. I say seems like because we live unfortunately pretty far from it, so it's not our primary parish.
Well, no, it does have a good amount of people there. Especially there's a homeschooling hub in the area that kind of corrals around there. Yeah. And uses that parish as a base for a lot of things. But somebody saw me there, and I get a message on Instagram saying, I don't know if this is weird, but I think I saw your husband, because I don't know how many bucks.
Guilty.
So my eye got recognized because of my husband's hair.
Great.
That doesn't happen that often.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So thank you for the shout out.
Yeah, if you're in Wisconsin, or if you think you see me, just say hi. And if it's not me, well, I'm sorry.
Awkward.
Maybe you'll make a new friend.
Yeah. I thought you were a Catholic mom blogger. Pardon me.
Excuse me. Yeah. Well, speaking of the Catholic Mama Instagram,
we're going to talk about communism.
Speaking of that, we're going to talk about communism. So, everybody knows we're living in a clown world. Mm-hmm. There's some crazy. I really do think it's like 3 months of being pent up at home in quarantine just brought out a lot of aggression once people could get out of their houses.
There's a lot of factors at play going on. Yeah, definitely.
We are going to talk about communism specifically because, I think it's interesting. A lot of some events are happening over the past few days or weeks that are being likened to the Spanish Civil War trying to topple over the Catholic monarchy in Spain. I don't know, 120 years ago, something like that. I'm not. It's like super up to date. I read I think it's a Hemingway book. Is it Hemingway?
It is interesting to see the iconoclasts throughout history. It's a nice, interesting, historical parallels.
Yeah.
Throughout.
Yeah. So this particular incident that is lighting a fire for this whole conversation is, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, a statue in California of Father, or I should say Saint Sarah, who was a Catholic Franciscan priest who
missionary,
yep, who built the first 9 of the 21 famous missions in California, has a statue in a park, and it was toppled and spray painted, and the
whole parade,
dancing on top of it and claiming victory over something, history, I suppose,
right,
happened. And the fact is, I just noticed that on one of the news outlets, they referred to the people who had done this as protesters. They're
yes.
thugs, domestic terrorists.
Yep.
I don't know if protesters is the word I would quite use.
Right. And
there's a difference.
And the media is doing a lot of harm here because, peaceful protest is a very important thing. We want to support people's right to protest. And it's a shame because it takes away from the people who are actually peacefully protesting.
Right.
And it's kind of lumping them all together. So, we can express our opinions in peaceful ways to try to affect change. And even if I don't agree with what, people are protesting about, in any given situation, certainly I respect the right to gather and to protest. Distinctions are important. And people out there destroying the public property, and let's be, there's distinctions upon distinctions. And one mark of intelligence is whether people are able to make distinctions. And there's a famous article in philosophy, kind of famous, it's not that famous.
Famous to philosophers.
By a Catholic philosopher, right? Where he argues that the method of philosophy is making distinctions, discovering distinctions that really make a difference. And if you don't make important or discover proper distinctions, you'll be led to conceptual confusions and irrational conclusions. So, philosophers, sometimes people can get annoyed with philosophers because we like to be so nitty-gritty, but distinctions often make a big difference. So we have to make distinctions. And not only when it comes to defacing property, but there's distinctions between the monuments themselves. So, it's one thing to say, like, hey, I want to tear down a monument of somebody who really was a terrible person, like a Lenin, Ironically, that seem to be the ones that these people were going after, right? Versus a venerated Catholic saint where the majority evidence shows that he had great respect and often stood up for the native people, for example. Right, and
yes, because I think all of the claims against him have been refuted.
And it's really telling when people just say, well, we're just doing this, for racism or whatever, when they take down statues like this. It shows that, no, there's a deeper agenda here, right? It's clearly not just about flagrant historical injustices. Now, even if that was the case, here's another distinction, right? Because people will say, well, we've been trying to write to the politicians and get these taking them down, and they haven't been responding to us, so we're taking matters into our own hands. Imagine thinking that any time a politician didn't respond to your requests, that you could just take matters into your own hands and become a vigilante. I mean, there's many aspects of public society today. They get no response. I mean, there's tributes to Margaret Sanger out there, right? The racist founder of Planned Parenthood. And we don't see, really many people, at least on the religious side, the Catholic side, or conservative side, despite their many attempts to try and have Planned Parenthood rightfully defunded, hopefully preferably abolished forever, going and destroying these buildings, trying to take down these tributes to Margaret Sanger. Now, of course, there have been people who have gone to the extreme and conducted violence at Planned Parenthood, but they're always condemned almost universally by both sides, for example. Now, here's another distinction. The funny thing is that when it comes to Planned Parenthood anyways, there is a principal difference in the sense that the person who might try to enact force or aggression against Planned Parenthood is enacting force or aggression against somebody who is itself right now perpetuating the injustice of murdering an innocent person, which is very different than rioters and looters out there right now who are enacting aggression or injustice against innocent third parties. That's another distinction. See, distinctions do make a difference. Now, I'm not saying that justifies going out and attacking Planned Parenthood. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying these would be morally different cases, even if you were to try to make that argument. So, good thinking is hunting around for distinctions. Always. And we've just covered like 10 to 15 different distinctions which complicate these conversations.
Yeah. What's funny is a while back I asked you, what's the point of philosophy nowadays anyways? I just didn't understand. And then, but you get to a situation like this, and wow, how applicable. This isn't just old Greek men in togas hashing things out in the forum. I mean, this is where philosophy and good, the ability to think well comes into play.
Is there a distinction between tearing down a monument to a Catholic saint versus tearing down a monument to some flagrant abuser of slaves? Seems like there might be, right?
Yeah.
But even if there are monuments to morally egregious people, like truly horrible people, not people that were like mostly good but had some bad marks, which let's be honest, that's most
everybody,
people, right?
Yeah,
and
sure.
like now they want to tear down George Washington. And we know that George Washington had very mixed feelings about slave ownership, right? Towards the end of his life, it seems like the best evidence says that he really wanted to abolish it, but felt that it would tear the country apart. Now, the funny thing is, he was right. It would tear the country apart.
And it did, yeah.
But I think we could say that that was still the wrong decision. Now, isn't that funny? Because a lot of people make a parallel argument about abortion. Oh, if you try to make it illegal, you'd invite a civil war. Well, that was essentially Washington's judgment for not condemning or abolishing decision. Now, isn't that funny? Because a lot of people make a parallel argument about abortion. Oh, if you try to make it illegal, you'd invite a civil war. Well, that was essentially Washington's judgment for not condemning or abolishing slavery. But we all now think that he was wrong. He should have done it anyways, because some issues are so morally egregious that they have to be decided independent of any social consequences. Like they're so evil, they just have to be dealt with, like slavery was, like abortion is.
Oh.
Distinctions, more distinctions, right? So Washington and people like that are a tough case because, like these men were conflicted. They had sins, as we all have sins. But in other ways, they were great men, right? They're men with great legacies that do deserve to be preserved. And smart, intelligent people can look back at Washington and say what we just said. A man that seemed internally conflicted, divided, dealt with one particularly very morally terrible situation, made a wrong call on. But that doesn't mean that we condemn the man outright. We can say, no, that was the wrong
everything
call,
that he had done.
right? But there's also so much that he did that was great, and what so much of what you see about modern culture is they try and like squeeze confessions out of people. First off, they try and squeeze confessions out of people that are dead, which is weird. These leftists, but there's no
8-year-old tweets from Domino's.
or 8-year-old tweets from Domino's. But there's no countervailing mercy side to it. Like you get, Christianity, we have repentance, but we also have God's unlimited mercy and forgiveness. There's no mercy in modern culture. It's really quite sick. And so the confession that they're looking for out of people isn't a real confession. They're looking for a public demonstration.
Right. It's very similar to the French Revolution.
Oh, it's hand in hand.
Yeah.
I think the parallels are remarkably similar. So all of this is just to say that everything we're dealing with is complicated to such a degree that it never tends to go well when you try to have these conversations on social media, because people aren't patient enough or frankly skilled enough to make these important distinctions. But even if you had an issue with certain policies or things that are in place, you have to give us an argument of why you think that if politicians don't respond to your every whim right away, you go out and destroy things. Because normally what people do is they say, these politicians are failing me. We need to organize and get new politicians in to change these things.
Right, to actually operate within the law and for the common good.
Correct.
Yeah.
And there are obligations to that, right? And yes, we're
So
all in
all those-
situations where we think that there's things that the stupid politician, and there are many stupid politicians out there, they're failing me, they're not doing, we're trying. Okay. So
you run for office then.
Yeah, that doesn't mean you get to go desecrate anything that goes against your sensibilities or moral judgments, at least not right away. So
all those distinctions in hand, I posted the video of I called them out for the communist leanings that these are mostly Antifa, I think, at this point, correct?
Right. These are largely communist, socialist, Marxist groups, radically far left. This should be no mystery to anybody. I mean, it's admitted, it's avowed by them, right? Many of the leaders of these groups are radically far left. So there's deep Marxist, socialist, and communist ideologies running through all of this.
So I posted this video. This is just to give some context of why we're talking, because I actually got a message from somebody asking for context. So happy to oblige if you missed that story, because it disappears after 24 hours. Mm-hmm. I posted the statue being torn down, called them out, had a quote from George Orwell's 1984, which says that the party wants, rewrites history constantly. It's just whatever the party says, minute by minute, the history is changing. And then also Our Lady of Fatima and her messaging saying that Russia needed to, the errors of Russia needed to be dealt with. Mm-hmm. Russia needed to be consecrated to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and we needed to get away. And I made the distinction of saying that when she says Russia, she means communism and socialism and everything that comes along with that, which is basically the culture of death.
Yes.
Okay. So that's what I said. All true. It's just true. This is all true stuff. Mm-hmm. And somebody, I got a lot of great messages, by the way. If you messaged me and said, wow, thank you, I support this, I'm glad somebody said it, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. I love all the messages. And you know what? If anybody has any disagreements, we've said this before, just say something. Ask me a question. Could you clarify this, Christine? I don't know what you meant by this. I don't know if I agree with it. Can you explain further? Wow. That's a conversation.
Disagreements are fine.
I love healthy debates. I engage with you all the time as long as you say that I'm right at the end. No, I'm kidding. As long as you say that I'm right at the end. No, I'm kidding. No, anyway, so somebody came up and, said, you're a racist and a fascist.
Got the double whammy.
I did. Mm-hmm. Nobody's ever called me either of those things, so that's pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. God help your children. There's going to be lasting consequences for the fact that you raise them with such a closed mind. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of shaming, name calling. Yep. It was quite interesting. It was exactly what you would expect from somebody. What's it, NPC?
That's right. Yeah.
Go ahead and explain this one, because you're a gamer.
So there's memes that go around that explain this type of ideology. One of the terms is this idea of a social justice warrior. And NPC stands for non-player character. And if you're familiar with video games, non-player characters are just the sort of bots that run around, and they're stupid, right? And they just follow their programming, and they're exceedingly predictable, right? So you can always know essentially what they're going to do because they have their limited number of. So you can always know essentially what they're going to do because they have their limited number of programming lines, and it's just going to be one or the other. And oftentimes it's in a very predictable sequence as well. And you see that, and you saw that right here, where there's always a predictable sequence of people who are just sort of indoctrinated in this far left ideology. They find offense at something, they stop and shriek, they call names, they try to bully and shame, they often try to mob or draw a crowd in to it as well. So they try to mob. They try to force a public confession or repentance, but remember, there's no mercy there at all, right? And then once they have that, they then try to move on and find their next public demonstration, right? So it's all exceedingly predictable, and people, I guarantee, are probably nodding their head because you've probably seen this play out a million times on social media, and it's part of it. It's part of an ideology. In fact, it's part of a very specific. Trained ideology, Marxist ideology, that has understand this as movement organizers. They understand how to get this type of response from people for movements. Like, this isn't a random thing. And this isn't a conspiratorial thing either. I'm actually somebody who tries to very strongly ward off conspiracy theories. This is something that is quite well studied and quite well known and quite well admitted by organizational leaders as well. The famous line from Stalin of and other sort of communist movement leaders of taking advantage of the useful idiots, right? Of kind of taking advantage of what are otherwise fairly sincere people trying to do the best they can, whooping them up emotionally, and kind of turning them towards your purposes that they'll just assume uncritically, right? And if you can whoop them up with all sorts of moral fervor, all the better, right? So they have a sense of moral superiority. So that's all the kind of sick derangement that's going on. It is sick. It really is. Like
Pat said, you're probably nodding your head because if you've been on Facebook or God bless you if you've read the comments on a news organization's articles, have you noticed that those are the worst?
Of course.
Or even at the dinner table at a holiday. I mean, these do come up.
And you hear, this is the other important thing, you hear about the silent minority and, the silent majority and the loud minority. And this is reflected even in your inbox, right? You get an overwhelming number of positive responses, but it's always that loud minority that makes the impression. And, whatever you want to think about Donald Trump, and we really don't want, mean this to be a political episode, but sometimes politics presses into religion. It does. But whatever you think of Donald Trump, there's a reason he won, and there's a reason people didn't expect him to win, because they don't see often what I see. So I'm a business owner. I have a big kind of sample size of people. So I can see statistically the private message of people. So I can see statistically the private messages versus the public messages. I can see how people in the silent majority are thinking versus the people that are very loud in the public visible sphere. So before the last election, I was one of the few people that was saying Trump's going to win.
I know, I didn't believe it.
No, you didn't believe it. None of my friends believe it. I said, no, he's going to win. And I was very confident. And here, mark my words, he's going to win again. You can come back to this podcast. I'm not saying that's not an endorsement, right? We can talk about endorsing political candidates in another episode. Distinction. Prediction is not endorsement.
Yeah, right.
Another distinction. I'm just saying he's going to win. And I predicted this last time. And part of the reason is because there is this silent minority. But here's the danger, right? Is the silent minority can assume cultural and political control, and that's exactly what happened in Russia. Russia was not a popular uprising; it was a minority, a very small minority that a popular uprising. It was a minority, a very small minority that took power over aggressively and sustained that power through sheer tyranny. It was not a popular uprising from an economically suppressed class, as Marx would have preferred. It was not that at all. It was a minority that was loud enough and aggressive enough that got into control and kept control. So even though I'm saying Trump is going to win the next election, which I'm very confident he is, what I'm ultimately saying is the silent majority needs to stop being silent. You need to stop being silent. You need to stop being a coward. And I'm talking to all of you, right? The fact that my wife has more brass than most Catholic men on social media is shameful. The most men, and I am talking to men, not willing to talk out against socialism or communism or any injustice because you're afraid of being called a bigot or a fascist or a homophobe or a xylophone or any of these words that are just semantically meaningless, honestly, and that they're totally irrelevant, right? And they're meant to be rhetorical sleight of hand. So let's make some more distinctions, because a lot of this does tie into the whole Black Lives Matter movement, right? So every Catholic should affirm the proposition Black Lives Matter. But anybody who spent more than 5 minutes trying to understand the Black Lives Matter organization understands that they are run, organized, co-founded by people who are openly admitted radical Marxists and organizers of Marxist movements. You can find interviews with them. You can find their work where they admit this. And on their website, on Black Lives Matter website, it says we have our whole agenda is to disrupt the nuclear family unit. No Catholic can stand for that. To promote gender ideology, which is deeply against church teaching, on sexual ethics, on the sort of nuclear family unit. No Catholic can stand for that. To promote gender ideology, which is deeply against church teaching, on sexual ethics, on the sort of philosophical anthropology of man and woman. This is Marxism. It's a political Trojan horse. And any person who can make subtle distinctions can see this. And this is why you cannot get whooped up in the moral fervor of confusing these two things. Of course, the proposition Black Lives Matter, every Catholic says that's true. And anytime any black person is treated unjustly, especially if they're murdered at the hands of a police officer, you condemn it outright, 100%. But a basic principle of moral reasoning is you never repay one injustice with further injustice, right? You never, repay the injustice of George Floyd's death by going out and killing other innocent people in riots. And we're not just talking damage. True that human life has more value than property. Property only has instrumental value. Human life has intrinsic value. But these riots have literally cost innocent human life. You can never repay injustice with further injustice. And I posted something like this on my Instagram account where I tried to make these distinctions and say, look, we're not consequentialists, right? We don't make our way to a better society, to a good society, by trying to make an omelet by breaking a bunch of eggs, right? That's utilitarianism, that's consequentialism. All that needs to be condemned. So it's just very important to make sure that you're very, very careful about the types of movements you support, and make sure that they aren't acting as a sort of political Trojan horse to deeper ideologies, that they're not trying to shove through a certain agenda that is deeply immoral in and of itself, even if you agree on any one of their. But for example, take the Black Panthers organization. Most people would say that they can't support the Black Panthers because of all the sort of immoral strategies they used. But the Black Panthers, interestingly enough, were strongly against abortion and birth control. They often said that abortion and birth control were forms of black genocide. And as it happens, I agree with that. I actually really agree with the Black Panthers on that. But I could never in good conscience support that organization despite our agreement. Another example might be that you can be pro-Irish but completely anti-IRA. And you have to be careful about the rhetorical sleight of hand where somebody might say, hey, don't you think that, that the Irish deserve their dignity and respect and this? And you say, yeah. And then somebody would say, okay, so you support the IRA. And any sane person would say, no, I don't support the IRA. But then the sort of rhetorical move would be, oh, so you must be anti-Irish. No, I didn't say that, right? So these are the games that people play online. These are the tricks. These are the rhetorical tricks that people try to play. And you have to have the courage to stand up for that. And you have to have the courage to not back down, even if they start calling you names, because you need the courage to stand firm in the truth and say, yes, this is an injustice, but this is also an injustice. So I'm against this and I'm against that. And this is our moral obligation as Catholics. And we shouldn't think that making the right moral decision is always or necessarily going to be easy.
These are all very good points, and nobody can see me, but I'm nodding along going, yeah. Especially, you mentioned that the IRA versus pro-Irish example to me the other day. I was like, wow, it clicked,
Distinctions.
And you know what? Years ago, I would have felt very high-minded, very proud of myself, very puffed up, saying, well, no, I'm a democratic socialist, or I'm a socialist. Well, that's not real. Saying, well, no, I'm a democratic socialist, or I'm a socialist. Well, that's not real communism. I was pretty radical leftist for quite a while in my youth, but I'm susceptible to reason, which is why I am now a Catholic. So yeah, it's interesting. I would have 15 years or so, or 16, 17 years ago, I would have been on the opposite side of all of this. Mm-hmm. But that said, these are all the distinctions probably would have driven me crazy is what I'm thinking. I would have been like, well, you're getting too hung up on words, man. But it matters. So let's bring this all back to communism. What does this have to do with communism?
Okay, so let's focus on, again, kind of the core ideological commitments that Catholics need to stand against, especially if there are movements that are promoting socialism or communism. And we do need to make distinctions between, democratic socialism as it's promoted today. So let's start with Karl Marx. Most people are probably somewhat familiar with Karl Marx.
Right.
Is one of the originators of communism. Now, communism, in kind of a very, very broad sense, has quite historical roots. I mean, somebody could make the argument that Plato was promoting a form of communism with his guardian classes and philosopher kings all the way back, but it's in many respects also quite different than communism as it sort of developed from Karl Marx. So we'll just start with Karl Marx, but understand that the idea isn't like radically original to him in some sense, even though he's responsible for a lot of the ideas that moved it forward as a truly political force.
Got it.
So, okay, Marx, born 1818. It's always an easy year to remember. And the key aspects of sort of Marxist theory, and we're gonna go just kind of give the briefest introduction I can that I hope will be also sufficient so people can understand the history of this, where it goes wrong, and why we need to oppose it. So Marxist theory kind of, there's three critical aspects, and I recently went through all this on one of my Instagram stories. I was talking out about this too, so I'll kind of follow the general outline that I went through there, and then you can ask whatever questions pop into your mind, and we'll jam on this. So,
sounds good.
One is the kind of core kind of metaphysics, the worldview of Marx, which was called dialectic materialism. And this is about as much as it like hardly even rises to the level of nonsense, but it's a combination of essentially two different philosophical historical lines of thought that come both from Feuerbach, who's kind of like the godfather of atheism in many ways, and Hegel, and Hegel's sort of dialectic idealism. And without getting into too much detail about either of these, the sort of dialectic idealism of Hegel, it was sort of, everything that exists is sort of like the mind of God kind of working itself out over time. That's a massive oversimplification, but there's sort of this principle that's unfolding over time, that God essentially evolves, and we're all part of that evolution, right? And that it's idealistic. So it's really only mind that's fundamental. It then turns into matter and then comes back into mind. It really is hardly more robust than that. I know it sounds kind of silly, but it is silly. I remember when I was first studying Hegel, I'm like, what is this guy going on about? But so that's kind of the core, and I don't want to be uncharitable. I think it is obviously he's an important historical figure and has what Marx essentially does is he sort of takes that dialectic evolutionary process, this sort of principle of unfolding and evolution, and he combines it with a strict kind of materialism that he inherits from Feuerbach, where he's and for people who are unfamiliar, when we say materialism in a philosophical sense, we mean that like only matter exists. So there's no God, there's no human soul.
What you see is what you get.
Whatever exists is just sort of fundamentally reducible to physical stuff, whatever that physical stuff is. Mm-hmm. And Marx never really identifies what it is. But what's spooky about Marx is he essentially tries to attribute all these mysterious spiritual-like qualities to matter, like intentionality, like evolution, like directedness. And this is very out of step with most atheist materialists who just kind of hold a very kind of mechanistic, dumb view of the universe. For Marx, it's kind of this dynamic thing. So he kind of like puts all these spiritual qualities into matter, which is very spooky and unexplained. So here's the point I want to make about his core underlying metaphysics is if you already have independent reasons to think that both Hegel and materialism are wrong, which I think everybody should, then it's just all the more absurd to combine those two, right? and that's what
follow what Marx does
and follow
that,
it.
yeah.
And the truth is, virtually no philosopher takes dialectic materialism seriously, like virtually none. In fact, most of Marx's core tenets are universally rejected, even by most modern day Marxists. That's how off the mark he was. So that's kind of his metaphysical worldview. So automatically religion's out, right? There's no God, there's no soul. Whatever we get is of this world.
That already sounds
evolving.
problematic.
So yeah, I mean, in its core, philosophy, it's atheistic. So right away, Catholics are going to have a huge issue with this. Now, that's not to say that all socialists today are committed to atheism, but it's important to understand the atheistic origination. They are committed to atheism, but it's important to understand the atheistic originations of it, right?
Just as much as it's important to understand the racist originations of, say, Planned Parenthood.
Correct. Yeah, these are important,
they matter,
right? Yeah. So even though Planned Parenthood stayed racist, it didn't. Even though Planned Parenthood started racist, it doesn't mean that everybody working for Planned Parenthood today is still a racist. But there might be structural inequalities in Planned Parenthood that disproportionately affect black people, which is true. Which is funny because that's something that I agree with people on the left, that there are structural inequalities in society that resulted from historical acts of racism. And the greatest example is Planned Parenthood. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, they have no interest in correcting that true, quantifiable injustice with historical roots. We'll come back to that. Different conversation, right?
It's a very good one, but different. Yeah. Sorry.
So, yeah, dialectic materialism, atheism, every reason to reject this kind of fundamental worldview philosophy of Marx. Every reason to reject this kind of fundamental worldview philosophy of Marx. It's just silly, and virtually nobody takes it seriously these days. next to that, another critical theory of Marxism is this idea of economic reductionism or determinism, that all of history in its final analysis is reduced to some economic class struggle, that any major historical event or movement is the result of one economic class sort of rebelling against and uprising against another economic class. And this is ridiculous because it's just historically illiterate, right? So many, you can find selective examples where that might be the case, and certainly economics and classes have played important roles throughout through history. But there's also many clear, obvious examples where the major motivating factors in a historical movement were not economic, either purely or even largely, but they might be religious. For example, Judaism attributes these to economic class struggles, or the development of Greek civilization was largely developed by free people. The Renaissance was largely initiated by the educated class, right? It had nothing to do really with economic uprising. Mm-hmm. Or even the Reformation, which again has deep religious sort of launching point, but then was largely kind of initiated and implemented by kings and princes, by the upper classes, right? So, and again, it's so silly. It's so silly. And again, virtually no historian takes economic reductionism or determinism. So everything can reduce to economics in the past, and everything is determined by economics and class struggle. Yeah.
So I would say, just because I used to be a believer in all of this stuff years ago, I would have said that. Because again, facts don't really matter to the person who buys wholesale into this without too much critical thinking like I did. And I definitely wasn't esoteric knowledge there that is only available to people who will see it. So like,
wrap a little Gnosticism in it while you're going.
Well, yeah, there is the class struggle as the underpinning, but only, us enlightened ones can see that there. You're just, viewing this from some different perspective that just isn't as in the know as. Right. I'm just saying, I get it. We're not working with people.
And it's
typically we're not working with people who are
a fallacy called appeal to snobbery, right?
Yes.
It's I've never actually opened a history book, but I somehow stand athwart everybody who is a trained, specialized historian on these matters.
It's not snobbery. That's a very good word for it. Yeah. So there is a lot of snobbery, at least when I was this way, and a lot of the people that I used to hang around with at the time, very snobbish.
So the point I'm trying to show with this sort of origins of Marxism is show just how unsound the foundations of Marxists are from the start. Like they're how unsound the foundations of Marxists are from the start. Like they're really bad. And again, they've almost all been universally rejected. So we have a historical analysis, that's trash. We have a philosophical, metaphysical analysis, that's trash. And now we have an economic analysis, right? And Marx was very famous for his sort of labor theory of value and a surplus theory of value. Again, virtually universally rejected by modern economists today. And the labor theory of value is essentially the thing's worth is equivalent to the amount of labor that goes into it. And this ignores factors that modern economists consider, such as, well, things are also valuable to the extent that they're useful or they're scarce, for example. So a labor theory of value, you bring up the analogy, is that what you're going to...
No, go ahead. But I was just curious, what about efficiency? Does that mean if something doesn't take as much labor because you're efficient at it, does that make it less valuable?
Yeah, let's circle back to that, because labor theory would measure the amount of exploitation a capitalist gain from the workers, and that would just be taking the difference between use value and exchange value. The point of all of this is that it's all based on an unsound foundation of labor theory of value, because that has been, again, almost universally rejected and replaced what's known as the marginal utility theory of value, or the subjective theories of value. And we know this. Simple thought experiments will show how ridiculous labor theory of value is. Like, you're hired to dig a pool for somebody in their backyard, dig a hole. Well, does that hole become more valuable just because you took 10 times more effort and time to dig it with a spoon than a shovel? Of course, people would no, that's ridiculous, right? It's just got value based on the use I get out of it and the scarcity of the labor and all these other things and how much I really want it and all these other a lot of subjective elements, right? And it's important from a philosophical perspective to understand that economic value is different than, say, moral value. But that's another different conversation. But distinctions. It's the theme of this episode. So philosophically, metaphysically, Marxism is off to a terrible start. Historically, terrible start. Economically, terrible start.
And yet it persists.
Yeah, and now this isn't to say that Marx didn't have any good critiques or anything good to say, but it's kind of the key critical aspects of Marx are just really, really bad. And it is interesting to see that they've been virtually universally rejected, even by most people who continue on with Marxist ideology in other ways. So that's kind of important to understand, just kind of from the origins, because if somebody's, as Aristotle, who wasn't way off the mark at the beginning, he was off maybe on some of the minor details, but I would say he was right on the broad strokes, whereas Marx is wrong on the broad strokes, maybe had some good minor points. Isn't that the case of what we have with the havoc that socialism and communism has wreaked, the millions upon millions of deaths, and the misery and suffering that socialistic and communistic governments have inflicted upon this world? Because Marx fundamentally gets the world wrong. He gets human nature wrong. He doesn't understand humans as being made in the image and likeness of God. He's a reductionist to the point of absurdity. And so we might expect that if you're that wrong from the beginning, you might have some bad outcomes. But who would have expected that the outcomes would have been quite as bad as they were?
Right. From 1917, with the Bolshevik Revolution's beginnings, to say now, that's 100 million deaths worldwide that can be attributed to communism.
A good at the University of Hawaii. They also communistcrimes.org has a compilation of this, but University of Hawaii has kind of statistics on death by government, and I would encourage everyone to check that out.
Right, because I think one of the
and to see how many of those correspond with socialist and communist regimes.
Yeah.
It might alarm you.
Yeah, because I think if you usually in a critique of Christianity, you'll hear things. Well, there's the Spanish Inquisition or the Crusades, and this how many people were killed. That now every life matters, right? Every human life has dignity, but you can't look at that, and say, oh, the death toll from or what Christians did during the Crusades justify or negates how bad the communists have treated people.
People want to point to Christianity and say the Crusades and the Inquisitions, which, again, do your research and see how many people actually died. We're not saying it was justified or it was unjustified. We'll leave that neutral, but just compare the numbers. Justified or it was unjustified. We'll leave that neutral, but just compare the numbers just out of curiosity and see what is really the blight on society. Just example, the estimate at the University of Hawaii for the Soviet Gulag state alone, 61,911,000 murdered. 61,911,000 people murdered under the Soviet communist regime. The communist China, 35,236,000 murdered. And it looks like in his important notice that he's not even adjusting for the famine, Mao's famine.
Oh, wow.
So we're talking like just murder. Just murder.
Not people who have died from consequentially have died.
So yeah, we can link that if anyone wants the actual stats on that. Again, hopefully this shouldn't be surprising to people. I think maybe not millennials who are growing up now, but most people who. But should we just get back to kind of the main critiques of communism and socialism and stuff?
Yes,
okay,
let's do that.
It's also important, again, distinctions and terms. Socialism was, what's the difference between socialism and communism? Well, communism was kind of the end goal for Marx, right? This classless society, and he was really ultimately an anarchist, that eventually the state would dissolve. Socialism was really meant to be an interim state, where the state served to function to get to that end state of communism. So that's traditionally how it's understood, right? So socialism and communism are the complete abolition of private property, right? Where the government owns the means of production. That's the traditional definition. Government-owned means of production, meaning there's no private property, no private businesses, firms, any of that, right? It's all state-owned. It's complete totalitarianism. It is. And socialism is kind of the interim state where you got to kind of like work out the kinks and, break the eggs to make the omelet. But eventually, the totalitarianism, it is. And socialism is kind of the interim state where you got to kind of like work out the kinks and, you know, break the eggs to make the omelet. But eventually, the idea, the utopian fantasy, was that would eventually dissolve.
How do you get to the point where somebody's going to give up their power?
It's a joke. It's a joke. Come on, it's a joke. It's a total joke. Yeah, this is part of the problems, right? It fundamentally misunderstands human nature, misunderstands sin. It both overestimates human nature and underestimates it in many different directions. And again, most people with just a modicum of reason can be like, that just sounds so silly. It is. And that's why it's never worked. And then people will say, oh, that's just not true socialism. No, that was true socialism. That's exactly true socialism. Well, that's not true communism. Yeah, because you're never going to get true communism. It's a fantasy. Yeah. The most you can get is true socialism, which is this horrible interim state
that kills
to prove that you're never going to get true communism. So traditionally understood, socialism is the abolition of private property, where the government owns the means of production. And immediately we have a problem as Catholics, because as Catholics we believe we have a natural right to private property. So socialism fundamentally denies our natural right to private property, which is an extension of our right to life, our dignity. We're rational animals, so we are meant to organize and prepare the means for not just ourselves, but nature is also seasonal. We need to store things, right, through seasons to care for ourselves, and not just ourselves, but our family. That I need to make sure that I have enough to care for you, the kids, and their futures as well. So the right to life, from the right to life, extends the right to private property. Doesn't mean it's an unlimited right. Doesn't mean that I can just hoard everything I want or this, that. There are bounds in traditional natural law of how far that will go. But the church has always affirmed that we have a God-given right how far that will go. But the church has always affirmed that we have a God-given right to private property, and socialism denies that. So we have a fundamental tension there, and on a moral level, not just an economic level, not just a pragmatic level, but a fundamental tension on a moral level, where socialism is denying humans an essential right that the church boldly affirms. Right
now, heading to the Acts of the Apostles, we'll see in one passage, and I cannot think of it right now, where so-and-so, they talk about selling things. Yeah,
didn't they just live in communes, right? Yeah. This is a common thing that was brought up. Yeah, but that was voluntary, right? This is distinctions. If a bunch of Christians want to get together and say, hey, we'll put all of our stuff together, we'll provide for each other, nobody has an issue with that. Yeah. And we see that in monasteries, actually, a lot. And that's fine. And it's voluntary. And there's actually probably something very noble about that in many respects. Not appropriate for everybody, but might be very appropriate to do for a living, how much you're going to get, where you're going to live, and everything else. That is radically different than people in the early church deciding to kind of band together and live communally. Right. Yeah. So socialism and communism is not just voluntary communal living. Distinctions. Going to keep being annoying about that.
No, that's very
important.
If you don't,
but you hear that, and the reason you hear that is because people aren't making proper distinctions.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's keep going here. So I listed what I think are like the three, and there's a lot, but I think there's three major issues with socialism and communism traditionally understood. One is the abolition of private property, which we just talked. So we have a fundamental moral problem, right? Now, also historically, we know that socialism always interferes with the family unit, right? Because family units tend to not jive well with tyrannical regimes, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, you how can you have complete and total
not jive well with tyrannical regimes, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, you how can you have complete and total allegiance to the state if you have feelings and allegiances to your own family,
right? And religion and the church and all this. So we know there's all these other historical instances, but we'll just focus on like three fundamental points. So one is the abolition of private property. No Catholic can stand for that. The Church affirms that we have a God-given right to private property, which extends from our God-given right to life, which is just part and parcel of our having human dignity, being made in the virtue, in the image and likeness of God. Okay. Two other ones. One is called the economic calculation problem. This one's a little bit more technical, and you're going to find it in thinkers like Mises and Hayek and economists who've critiqued socialism. But it essentially comes down to this, and it's the virtual impossibility of a massive bureaucratic organism, right, the state, to assimilate really an impossible amount of information of how to produce and distribute goods. All know how to make a pencil? And the answer is no, right? None of us know how to make a pencil. And just all the factors that go into making a pencil, where to find I was going to say lead, it's probably graphite. Like, see how little I know, right? Where you get the wood, where do you ship the wood from, where do you cut the trees down from? What's that like little metal thing on the end? The
machines to put that all together.
The machines. How is all of this coordinated? Well, it's coordinated on a very small scale of individuals and firms that set prices in an economy. And prices, in quick terms, work as signals. They're signals to the economy of how to allocate resources based on supply and demand, right? But you cannot get that. You will never get that type of efficiency when you eliminate private firms that can't set prices. Once you get rid of the price mechanism, you lose all that coordination, you lose all that efficiency. So the government then has to try and figure all this out, right? It has to try and figure out everybody's needs, has to try and figure out all the production, all the means of production, figure out everybody's needs, has to try and figure out all the production, all the means of production, all the distribution. How is it ever going to get that information? Even if it could get that information, how could it ever get it as efficiently as a market system, for example, that can set prices where everybody kind of is a signal to everybody else based on their current demands, their current supply, right? There's this incredible coordination. Milton Friedman, a famous economist, has a lot of good books on this and a lot of good examples if you want to dive deeper. But the point is that the economists will argue this is an in-principle problem. This isn't something that could be solved through technology or trial and error. This is a problem that is if not logically impossible, it's virtually impossible. No government could ever possibly meet this type of demand.
Well, just even at a very real and current context, in India during the recent health crisis and lockdown over quarantine, the government text in India during the recent health crisis and lockdown over quarantine, the government took over food supply chains. And what happened? These poor people are starving.
Right.
Right, they didn't know how to run the food supply.
Yeah, and so what's and that's just one area of the economy, right? So imagine the government taking over everything, and this is okay. Here's a way I love kind of hypothetical thinking, right? So if the economic calculation problem is true, might we expect issues with production and supply in communist countries? Yeah, we would expect that. What do we see? Massive famine and death. Yep. Massive famine and death. There's people eating flamingos and garbage in Venezuela, right? This is the reality of the economic calculation problem of how the government, the state, cannot efficiently allocate resources because it cannot attain the relevant information to do so without the market setting those signals over the whole economy. You're going to suffer this economic calculation problem in principle, and we've seen the disastrous, horrific effects of this. So that is, I believe, another insuperable problem. And then the third one I'll mention just for this podcast is the incentive problem, right? So if everybody is sort of equalized, right, then you not only don't have an incentive to work harder because there's no profit motive, there's no profit incentive, no way to kind of elevate your status in life or anything like that. But you now have every economic incentive to slack off, right?
I'm going to get paid the same.
Right,
yep.
Right. And not only that, but like, what incentive would there ever be to do the dirty jobs? Who's going to do the menial work, the tedious work, the work that people...
the government will come in and tell you what to do.
Right. So no matter what, then, if that's going to happen, well, now you are going to have classes again. Because maybe people won't be resentful about income, but they'll certainly be resentful about job assignments. Right? Well, why does this guy get that job and I'm stuck, scrubbing toilets all day? See, I get that job and I'm stuck, scrubbing toilets all day. See, market systems can accommodate for this because if there's demand, you can keep rising the salary or the wage to compensate for the undesirableness of certain jobs. You can't have that. You can't have that inequality in communism or socialism. So you have an incentive problem. You have an economic calculation problem, you have an incentive problem, and you have a moral problem, right? So socialism and communism gets three more things wrong, right? It gets morality wrong, human rights of property. It gets economics wrong, economic calculation, and it gets human psychology wrong, incentive problem. So we're nothing but strikeouts here, right? This is terrible stuff, friends. This is terrible, terrible stuff. And it's not just us being religious why we should reject this. Yes, the Catholic Church has formally condemned this. We'll link to the papal encyclicals if you want to read those. You definitely should. But you have every good person should be a socialist or communist, and certainly no good Catholic can be a socialist or communist. And then let me just finish with the final distinctions, because socialism is kind of used equivocally today. Well, I'm a democratic socialist, and what about these Nordic states? And the final distinction we need to make there, which is very important, is that socialism is not the same thing as social welfare. Socialism is not the same thing as social welfare. So you can be totally against socialism as what we just talked about, the abolition of private property, trying to move towards a classless society, governmental means of productions, but still for social programs, whatever they may be, social security or public education or stuff like that. I would argue certain social programs we should be for, actually. So socialism is not the same thing as social welfare or a welfare state. There's a difference. You can have a very quite free market economy with expanded welfare states. That's what the Nordic countries are. That's what the president of Denmark has come out at least one time very strongly and said, stop calling us Haitian or stuff like that. I would argue certain social programs we should be for, actually. So socialism is not the same thing as social welfare or a welfare state. There's a difference. You can have a very quite free market economy with expanded welfare states. That's what the Nordic countries are. That's what the president of Denmark has come out at least one time very strongly and said, stop calling us a socialist country. We're just not, right?
Yeah.
We just have an expanded welfare state. And if you look at these socialist these democratic socialist countries, which are really not, a lot of them have been paring back their welfare states recently because there's just issues with them in terms of efficiency and economy and spending and all this. But that's a different discussion. And again, this is why distinctions matter, because you could be whole and should be wholly against everything that we just talked about with socialism and communism, but you could have a very open and honest debate about what degree of social programs a country or society should have, or even if certain industries should be socialized. So maybe, and then once you have those distinctions made, then you can hopefully have productive conversation. But if you're conflating between the two, but let me also be clear, a lot of quote-unquote democratic socialists aren't just talking about a free society with an expanded welfare state. They want full-on socialism, like true socialism. So if you're having a conversation, you need to make them get clear on what it is that they're promoting.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but yeah, if you're having these conversations with friends or family or, I don't know, strangers online, although those aren't as productive, ask them what they mean by that. And I love that when I was talking to John DeRosa about combating or defending Christianity against popular atheistic slogans, it really comes down to asking them to explain what they mean by that, or where did you hear that,
right,
and then going from there, just to make sure, because it is important to get those terms correct and make sure that you're talking about the same things.
Yeah.
And make sure that you're talking about the same things.
Yeah.
I would also challenge you to, if you're on the fence or know somebody who's on the fence, I personally know of many people who either they themselves, or because they were old enough at the time, or their parents fled from the USSR. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell you, I had one kind of crazy lady tell me those were the good times about communism, but she was nuts. But everybody else will outright condemn socialism and at least the desire for the communist state.
Very common.
They've lived it and they know it. And even if you go and you look at these poor people in Venezuela who are living this nightmare right now, they don't want any of it.
Yeah, there's a friend of mine in the fitness industry. I'll just keep him anonymous because I don't know how much he would want this known, but he talks about the sort of immigrants' advantage, and he's from a communist country, and he's like, and they actually are disadvantaged because they don't know. And he argues, because I know where I'm from, because I knew of how little the opportunities I had and how awful life was. Like, I've wanted to do nothing but just work my butt off since I've been here, right? And people ask me, how are you so motivated? He's like, because of where I came from and how bad it was. So in the small business world, there's a number of people, it's actually pretty common, of people who are immigrants that become successful because they don't take America for granted, like these sickos out in the street. or doing, and they've seen it, they've lived it, and they've thankfully escaped from the horrors of communism.
Yeah, I realized at one point in my youth when I was anti-America for a while, it came and went in spells, but it came to me that if I had the time after school or after, outside of college classes, when I wasn't really working much, and maybe just like a part-time job here or there, and I had my own car, and yet I still had time to complain, was I really complaining about anything worthwhile? Was I really saying that I was anti-American for any good reason? No, I was just being a brat.
Yeah. There's a lot of brattiness out
there. There is a lot of bratting. This is what happens when you give a whole generation participation trophies.
Yeah, and this isn't to say there aren't injustices that are being rightfully protested. But
yes,
both things can be true. There can be injustices that are being rightfully protested.
It's not an either
and
or.
There can be a bunch of brats out there.
Yeah.
And let me finish with this, right? We know that this sort of the hysteria, the push for communism, socialism, the name calling online, the bullying online, it's getting worse. And I'm really calling on Catholics out there to start speaking up against this stuff and just understand that you will be called names. But you're not, the ideology of these people, you're not safe. It's not like you're just, if you just want to be left alone, you'll be left alone.
Yeah,
no.
we're past that point.
They will keep pushing until they have things exactly how they want it. And it doesn't matter. So the question is not, isn't when you're going to speak up, but if you're even going to get the chance to speak up, and that chance is now.
Yeah, and you know what? Yeah, if you feel deeply when somebody says something mean to you, or you feel like you're getting bullied, I totally understand it. I have my skin, my neck still flushes red sometimes when I get all this stuff. But thankfully, Pat, you've got just a steel veneer.
People have been calling me names on the internet since I was 14 years old.
You're so good at it. So you've definitely helped me. But you know what? It's something. If you don't have a Pat in your life to tell you just to brush it off and help you in that respect, I have found it's been so helpful. The kids that I've been reading about the saints a lot, just going back to the early saints and seeing how horribly Christians were persecuted at the very beginning. Getting called a name online ain't nothing.
It's not, and
getting called a name online ain't nothing.
It's not, and you trust in God, trust in God's care here, and remember that you stand up for God here on earth. God's going to stand up for you,
right? Just as those were our readings today on what is it, June 20th,
yes.
21st.
It was quite coincidental, I thought. Providential. We don't believe in
providential.
Coincidence.
That's right,
indeed, and. I forget my point. So
and also to remember that Jesus did say that if you love Jesus, the world's going to hate you.
Yes.
So that's it. That's
and if you
speak the truth. Now, of course, be charitable, right? You're not going out there to hurt people's feelings on purpose, but speak the truth and let God's
direct. You don't have to be. You don't have to throw you don't have to be a provocateur. Just be a provocateur, but you should be direct and honest. And I'm probably more naturally provocative, but I've actually turned down my provocativeness. And just tried to focus more on being just direct and honest as I can about these issues. And look, just honesty is just uber offensive to people in and of itself, no matter how charitably you phrase it. So just have to just understand that that these people who are out there that really do hate religion and they hate America. They hate everything about our country and our faith. That they will call you names. So if you have the right expectations, then you won't be surprised.
Right? Yeah.
I just understand this is going to happen. I'm used to it. But I understand that it can be intimidating. I understand that you would rather just want nothing to do with it. But if you understand history, if that minority gets loud enough, if it gets aggressive enough, it doesn't need to become a majority.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to become a majority to take control. Yep. So people need to start speaking up, and it needs to be more than just a voter box. The voter box, sure, culture matters, voices matter, and don't think that you're insignificant. You're not. Every voice adds up. Every voice matters.
And again,
it can just be sharing this podcast.
Right,
let them attack me. I don't care. Send them my way. What do I care? Let them fill my inbox or my wall. I don't care. Tag me if you want.
Yeah, we have every Catholic saint is a beautiful example of living the faith out as one person. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, they had no idea what they were doing, and if they were going to make a difference at all anyway, but they got started. Just be bold. Now more than ever, we need bold Catholics living out a Catholic life, even if it is in a small, little, tiny corner of the world.
Amen.
Just be bold. Be bold in your Catholicism, and the Lord will remember you in heaven. All right, everyone. We'll be back on the next episode. We will finish finally our 3-part series on Catholic sexuality and natural family planning. We're making our way towards there. So
beautiful.
Next time. But man, this was just such a hot topic. We couldn't help ourselves.
It was fun.
It was fun. And thank you. I got to tell you, socialism, when it's prettied up, every time they pretty it up, but it's awful. And to hear the background of it and the logical explanations of why this simply does not work, it's a non-starter, is very helpful to me.
Especially for Catholics, it's a non-starter.
Right, yes, for Catholics especially. So thank you, Pat. Yep. I mean, you're always so good with this stuff. All right, everyone, if you don't want to miss any episodes, please always hit subscribe. And, of course, if you have a minute or two, leave a
And if you hate
nice
socialism, leave a 5-star review, please. That's one way you can help.
That's right. Yeah. Have more people find the podcast and get them excited about the Catholic faith, because this is why I do this. And Pat does this with me, because we're just so excited. It's the same thing as, a person who's left a communist country comes to America, doesn't want to go back to where they came. This person, myself, and I know what it's like to be without God, and there is no way I'm ever going back that way. So I'm super passionate about sharing the Catholic faith and how to live a good Catholic life, as I learned this anyway as a convert, because I'm a convert. I know where I came from, and I know where I am now, and I'm not going to take that for granted. All right, everyone, until next time. I know where I am now, and I'm not going to take that for granted. All right, everyone, until next time. Until next time.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.